your prayers for all of these. All right, today we have our second to the last class in this series on the case for the Bible in the postmodern world. And
Okay, I found this on the web for on the case for the Bible and the postmodern world. Check it out.
Now, Siri, I'm not talking to you. I'm trying to talk to these people out here. Let me tell Siri to be quiet. Do y'all ever have that problem with that woman talking to you at the weirdest times? Okay. That kind of threw me off right there. You, quiet. Okay. So what do you say, love? I think we're good on that. What? Yeah, we're good on that too. I've got TV now. Yes, sir. All right. So today we're going to talk about two different things, both of which come up in the discussion with people who are pushing away from the faith and trying to find their own beliefs and being helped along by posts from postmodernists that try to get them not to believe in the Bible. But the first thing we're going to talk about is language and law in the Bible. And the second thing we're going to talk about is the language of creation in the Bible, if we have that much time. We've talked about different kinds of literature in the Bible, and today we're going to talk about law. Now, postmodernism says legitimate moral choices are those that work for an individual or group in their particular context. So that means that morality is whatever works for you at a given time and place. The consistent philosophical name for that is pragmatism. Pragmatism is whatever works. There is no consistent morality there. It's just in whatever situation you are, in whatever country, in whatever social context, you do what works for you. That's pragmatism, okay? So according to postmodernists, we must abandon the vain quest for universal truth and normative standards of morality. So there are no normative standards, and there is no universal truth because they say all truth is filtered through fallible people, and it's simply their perceptions, and there's nothing more than fallible human perception. So first thing we're going to talk about relative to this is biblical law. Now someone might say, well, there are many other laws, even laws in the ancient world. There was the Code of Hammurabi for the Babylonian people, and there were other ancient laws, and there's biblical law, okay? That's true. Biblical law is quite different. It's based on the character of God, but let's just look at this. In the Bible, biblical law is in the book of Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers primarily in the Pentateuch. And then there are places in the prophets where the prophets give commands, and God says that those prophetic commands are law. Good example is 2 Chronicles 29:25, where the laws of worship were commanded by the Lord through the prophets. In this case, Nathan the prophet and Gad the prophet. Okay, and this was law. The Hebrew word Torah, law, refers loosely to teaching, but there's lots of law in the Old Testament. If you start in Exodus 20, he says, I am the Lord your God who brought you up out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make unto yourselves any graven image or any likeness of anything that is in the heaven above or earth beneath or waters under the earth. You shall not bow down yourself to them nor serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. See? And then he goes on with the thou shalt and the thou shalt nots. And it was made clear to people what they must do and what they must not do, okay? That's called apodictic law, or I'm not sure what the modern term would be, James Venus, but it's the kind of law which has no ifs in it. And you have it in the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not, okay? Then you start after that in Exodus 21 with if this happens, then this is what you do about it. If somebody commits this crime, then you do this penalty. If this, then that. That's called casuistic or case law, okay? And so you have both kinds in the Pentateuch, in the Bible. And in that day and time, Israel was under the law of God as both their civil law and their religious law. So there was no difference between the civil law and the religious law. It was one and the same, see, because it was all God's. It was God that was giving it to them according to the Scriptures. In Deuteronomy 28, if you turn your Bible to Deuteronomy 28, when Moses summarizes that law, Deuteronomy 28, starting in verse 1, Moses is summarizing all of the law that God gave to them, and he says, if you do these things that I've commanded you this day, then all these blessings will come to you. And he gives the blessing in this and blessing in that. Then down in verse 15, he says, if you do not do the things that I've commanded you, then all these curses will come upon you. See? So you know what you're supposed to do. I've spelled it out. If you do it, you'll be blessed. If you don't do it, you'll be cursed. Now, if you can, look up Deuteronomy 31, verses 24 through 26. And I don't have it memorized. I might have once, but my brain is foggy. But Deuteronomy 31, 24 to 26. This is where Moses tells them to take this law that he has given them and to put it beside the Ark of the Covenant in the most holy place in the temple. See, that you couldn't find a more holy place than that in all of Israel. That was in the Holy of Holies beside the Ark of the Covenant. Notice what he says when he says that. He says, so that it may be there for a witness against you. So this shows that this law was not just for that generation. It was for a witness to them in future generations. And you'll find David 400 years later talking about meditating in this law day and night and walking according to this law. You'll find Ezra nearly 1,000 years later reading this same law to the people when they come back out of captivity and urging them to keep that same law. So here you have a law that was given in something like 1440 BC, and at 500 some odd BC, it's still legitimate law. It hasn't changed. It's the same law, okay? So it seems that it wasn't very elastic, and it wasn't very changeable as far as the Israelites were concerned, because they believed it came from God, okay? Now, throughout Scripture, in the Old Testament and New Testament, you have law. Law is where commandments are given, and they're coming from God through his prophets like Moses, and they're expected to keep those commandments. There are so many different examples, but I think one thing that we often miss is we also have law in what we call the New Testament, okay? The Sermon on the Mount, Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, is teaching, but it's also law. Because Jesus said, you've heard that it was said, and he's talking about the scribes and Pharisees, but then he says, I say unto you, and he lays down law about all kinds of things, about oaths, about marriage, about love your neighbors yourself, about all kinds of different things. He lays down law. In fact, at the end of that sermon, Matthew 7:24, Jesus said, whoever hears these words of mine and what? Does them. Notice, you hear these words of mine and you do them. You will be like the wise man that built his house upon the rock. But then he says, whoever hears these words of mine and does not do them. That sounds remarkably like Deuteronomy 28, doesn't it? When Moses gave the law and he says, if you do these things, all these blessings will come upon you. But if you don't do these things, all these curses will come upon you. So the teaching of Jesus is in the form of law, in the sense that when he gives commands, which he did, he expects people to understand them and what else? Obey them. Okay? So there was commandments. And then, when the Great Commission was given, you go and make disciples of all the nations, then he said, teaching them to observe all things that I, Jesus, have commanded you. Okay? So Jesus was the bringer of grace in that he brought us a system of grace, but he brought us law, his commands. And as we try to keep those commands, the trying to keep those commands is the condition of his grace. We can't keep them perfectly, but he definitely gave us law. Okay? So there's a difference between saying we are not under law as a system of justification and saying that we don't have any law today. And we don't have time to go into all that, but we can another time. Now, there's also biblical law in New Testament letters or epistles. All right, so you remember when Jesus was talking to his apostles before he ascended into heaven, and he said, whatever you guys bind on earth will have been bound in heaven, and whatever you guys loose on earth will have been loosed in heaven. Matthew 16:19 or so. And he says it again in Matthew 18:18. See? So the apostles were going to function as the ambassadors of Christ, and they would speak for Christ, and they would be speaking what Christ wanted them to speak. And they, in those communications that they gave, were giving law. Example, in 1 Corinthians 7, when Paul was giving some commands regarding marriage and divorce and all that kind of stuff, if you look at 1 Corinthians 7:10, I think it is, he says, to the married I say, yet not I, but the Lord. Meaning, in that passage, Jesus Christ gave you this law in Matthew 19:9 and in Matthew 5:32 and in Luke 16:18. Jesus gave you this law. So it's not just me that's saying it, it's the Lord. See? But then Paul goes on to say in verse 12, to the rest I say, not the Lord. Meaning, some people have misconstrued that to say that now what Paul says doesn't make any difference. That's not what he's meaning. He means that Jesus in his earthly life didn't cover this particular aspect. But I'm going to cover it. See? And he says, if you're married to an unbeliever, this is what you do. Jesus didn't talk about that. You read the Gospels, you won't find Jesus talking about that. But Jesus has instructed Paul to talk about it. In 1 Corinthians 14, verse 37, Paul says, if anyone among you seems to be contentious, let him know that the things I am writing to you are the Lord's commandment. Did you get that? The things that I am writing to you are the Lord's commandment. 1 Corinthians 14:37. So the apostles were conveying the commands of Jesus. They were conveying Jesus' law. Okay? So the New Testament epistles have law, and so do the Gospels have law. Okay? Some people think that why should we emphasize the commands of Jesus or the apostles in the Gospels? Well, I think we've explained that, but there's a whole lot more to it. That's not the purpose of this class in here. This class in here is trying to address postmodernism and its approach to law. Postmodernism would say that any law, even biblical law, is from a particular cultural and social context and is only valid for those particular people in that particular cultural or social context, and it is not valid for us today. We live in a different culture and a different social context, And just like those human beings made up their own law in their context, we make up our law which works for us in our social context. So he's saying that even in the Bible, what we have is people unaided by God, and they made up their own laws that worked for them at that time. But we would believe, see, that God gave those laws, and those laws are good for all time. This is the difference between what Bible teaches and postmodernism. Now, consider the fact that postmodernism distrusts language as a conveyor of any kind of absolute truth, whether it's moral truth or other kind of truth. However, language communicates law, which is clearly understood. Now, if you read your Old Testament, did the people of Israel understand the law that Moses gave and the penalties attached to it? They absolutely did. See? Now, if they didn't understand it, then they wouldn't be able to say, well, this is legal and this is illegal. See? But they did understand that, and there were penalties attached to it. They understood that if you do A, B, C, you're going to get either stoned to death, or you're going to get your hand cut off, or you're going, whatever it is, this is what you're going to get. And they lived by that. They understood law. We today understand that this is legal and this is illegal, right? We understand that. We might try to get around it, but we understand the law. So another thing that comes into this discussion now is the fact that only humans can produce and process complex language. And the law is complex language. But only humans have the capacity to produce complex language and process complex language. Now, yes, chimps can make certain grunts and everything and simple things, but they can't understand law, spoken law, and nobody else can but humans, okay? So now let's think about this a little bit more. Only humans can produce and process complex language, including the language of law, but law always assumes the ability of humans to understand law and live within law. Okay? So language must be able to communicate law that's understandable. It always has. It does in the Bible. Now, let's take that logically one step further. If humans are given law and there are penalties attached to breaking that law, then are we communicating responsibility or not? We are, aren't we? We are. Because if I can't understand the law, if I can't be sure what the law says, then how could I be held what? Responsible for the law. Okay? But clearly the Bible holds people responsible for law. Now in Ezekiel 18:4, God said, "Behold, all souls belong to me. As is the soul of the Father, so also the soul of the Son. The soul that sins, it shall die." Okay? Which means people are responsible to God. If they couldn't understand God, if they couldn't comply with the law, then how could God hold them responsible? Then he says in the later part of that chapter, Ezekiel 18, "The Son shall not bear the iniquity of the Father. The Father shall not bear the iniquity of the Son. The righteousness of the righteous shall be upon him. The iniquity of the sinner will be upon him. The soul that sins, it will die." See? Then finally, at the end of that chapter, he says, "Why will you die, O house of Israel? Repent and live." That shows that people have a free will to process the law and to decide whether they're going to try to live by it or not. But the law is communicated how, church? Through what medium is it communicated? Language. language. And language is one of those things that places man above every other being in the universe. Man has the ability of language. Being sort of a knee-jerk linguist myself, and having looked into many different languages, the more I look into human languages of all shapes and sizes, the more I'm convinced that there has to be a God. Language is mind-blowingly amazing. Think about this. How can it be that the same ideas can be communicated with an infinite number of different symbols? Have you ever looked at Mandarin symbols, Japanese symbols, Korean symbols, Malaysian symbols, Indo-European symbols like we have in French, Spanish, German, Portuguese, English, all those A, B, C's, and D's, you know, those are our method of, have you ever looked at Hebrew and Arabic and the totally different symbols there, and Coptic and the totally different symbols there, and the Cyrillic Russian alphabet and the totally different symbols there? All of those, and any others that we might create, can communicate the exact same ideas. Now you stop and think about that for a minute. That is way up there. That is way up there in intelligence and in, you know, it's, but now, why so many different symbols on the planet that communicate the same ideas? Well, we read about it in the Bible in Genesis chapter 10, but think about this. And I was reading some, quote, scientific studies this last week about this. Human babies are born with, they've proven this, they're born with the ability to learn any language to which they are exposed. So let's say you got this little baby, like some of y'all have had, and from the time it's born, it's exposed to Mandarin and Portuguese. That little baby will grow up speaking fluent Mandarin and Portuguese. What classes did it take? Didn't take any. It just listened and looked and observed, and it'll speak Mandarin and Portuguese. Now, if you put that little baby in another place when it was 3 or 4, and they started hearing a third language regularly, and learning some basics of that third language, it wouldn't be any time before they'd pick up that third language also. That's just crunch on that in your head for a minute. Do you realize how mind-boggling that is? How mind-boggling that is. Should it be mind-boggling that the maker of the universe chose to communicate his will by what medium? Language. Language. Language which can be understood, and language upon which we can act. Okay? Very interesting. Maybe not to you, but the more I get into it, see, the fact that I've been into so many different languages, it blows my mind worse and worse every step I take. It just is amazing. Okay, so law assumes, the written law of God assumes the idea of human responsibility and accountability and the ideas of reward and punishment. If you do ABC, then I will bless you. If you don't do ABC, then I will curse you. I will punish you. Okay. Now, who wants to ask a question on some of that before we move on from that? Language and law. Yes, Brother Damon. God's going to curse you, yeah. Yeah, if he says, in fact, if you read Deuteronomy 28 all the way to the end, that I'm going to bring other nations against you and destroy you if you don't do what I tell them to do. And getting back to that, some people are still into the, is Israel God's chosen people? Read Deuteronomy 28 and see what it says about if you don't do what I tell you to do. Yeah. Yeah, if they did what he wanted them to do. Okay. Now, so, if you read the Bible as the Bible is presented, when you're reading law sections of the Bible, and especially if you read that in the context of what's going on, did God expect people to take that law literally? Absolutely, without exception. He expected them to take it quite literally and do quite literally what it said. Okay? When they didn't do what it said, were there consequences? Absolutely. Okay? So yes, we should take the Bible literally when it intends to be taken literally. Now, in fairness, the response of the deconstructionists would be, yeah, but you're assuming that the Bible came from God, and if the Bible didn't come from God, and if it was just the people of that time making up these laws for their own benefit, and they were just trying to manipulate people, then we should only take it with a grain of salt. And yes, if that's correct, then yes, they're right, but I don't believe that is correct, okay? So that's the answer that you would be given. So this brings us to we're shifting gears here. Should we take the creation story literally? There's a lot of people affected by postmodernism they're told that, you can't seriously believe the biblical creation story because science says A, B, C, D, E. All right, well, let's explore a little bit. First of all, what kind of literature is Genesis? We've already talked about if it's poetry, it's different than narrative. Genesis is actually narrative, but there was this young man. I was looking at different podcasts and things about all this week, and there was this young man that said this. He said, my faith was like this island surrounded by water, see? And the waters of science were creeping up on this island slowly until finally the ocean of science covered my island completely and my faith was gone. Okay, so this is how a lot of our children may feel when they go out and they go to college and they get into these atheistic professors that tell them they're crazy for believing in God, and they begin to hear all this stuff, and they get on TikTok, and everybody that's trying to destroy their faith, says all these things that are half-truths from science, and they feel like this young man. And they feel like their faith is being overwhelmed. So, if somebody is debunking the creation story, then first of all, let's look at the book of Genesis structurally and see what we've got here. Well, it is narrative, but it's a very highly structured narrative. You might, if you're interested in studying further on this, and I think I've covered it somewhere before, but this is the way that the book of Genesis is actually put together. This is the segments of the book of Genesis, not like I've divided it up. This is how Moses actually divided it up. You have this phrase, va'ele toledoth in Hebrew, that occurs when it says these are the generations, or some translations will say this is the genealogy, or this is the account. But it's this Hebrew phrase, va'ele toledoth. And it divides up the book of Genesis into these sections. Okay? It's very highly structured, put together in a certain way. All right? The creation story is the introduction to this highly structured narrative. The introduction kind of provides the basis for everything that comes after it. See, the creation story. All right? Now, even in the creation story, and several years ago we had a study called How to Study the Bible, the creation story itself is very highly structured narrative. Now, you can find this kind of structuring in other places in the Bible. For example, the letters to the churches in the book of Revelation. These things says the one who I know, you need to repent. He that has an ear, let him hear. To him that overcomes, there's a very highly repeated structure in that. You have the same thing here. Every day begins with, then God said. And then every day has a, let there be. See? And then most of the days have, and God saw that it was good. See? And then you finish every day with, there was evening and there was morning, day one. See? So if you go to the next offering here, you're at a different day. It begins the same way, then God said. And then let there be. See? And then you have evening and morning, day 2. Okay? Then you have down further, then God said, let there be. Down in verse 18 at the end, God saw that it was good. So the evening and the morning were the fourth day. Many years ago in Memphis, Jack P. Lewis taught us a little song in Hebrew. And it went, Boker, 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 and Erev, Erev, Erev. That's the words for evening and morning. See? And if you're in Israel, they'll say Boker Tov, good morning. Or Erev Tov, good evening, But evening and morning. But it's part of this structure that you see here. So it's narrative. It's telling you this happened and this happened and this happened, but it's highly structured narrative. All right? But people will say, well, preacher, even if you're going to say that this is narrative, what are you going to do about light without any sun, moon, and stars in the sky? Y'all have noticed that he created light, right? And then a few days later, he put the planets and moon and stars in their place and, some to give light for the day and others to give light to the night, it says. Okay, so what are you going to do with that? They'll also say, what are you going to do with the fact that things just popped up fully grown? I mean, come on. What are you going to do with that? That's kind of what the book of Genesis says, right? And then what are you going to do with, this all happened in 6 days. Come on. We all know that it took millions and millions and millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of years for all this to develop. Okay? And of course, why do we all know this? Because there's assumptions behind that. See, what are those assumptions? Okay, well, let's just talk about one or two of those things, and we'll probably run out of time. Fully grown trees. I've got some oak trees in my yard. And I'm almost positive that every one of those oak trees came from a what? It came from an acorn. And an acorn is a seed, right? So what are you talking about? Fully grown trees. Fully grown animals. We've got a baby doggie. Well, she's not a baby doggie. She's an 8-pound doggie. But she came from 2 other doggies, right? She came from a fertilized doggie embryo. That's where she came from. She didn't just pop up all chocolate brown and fully grown at 8 pounds. She didn't pop up that way. Okay? So doggies don't show up on the planet full grown, right? All right, how about fully grown humans? Same. All this IVP stuff has been going on in the news. And, you've got sperm and egg, and you've got fertilized embryo, and then it divides, and then eventually you've got a fully grown baby, and it's born, and it becomes an adult human being, right? And they said, this is impossible because trees grow from seeds, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. However, they'll say, but doesn't it take millions and millions of years for living things to evolve? Well, that's the theory. For life to come from non-life, it would take millions and millions of chance things happening over millions and millions of years. By the way, anybody making life from non-life? Not that I know of. And certainly not without extracting something from life. See? So I don't know that that's actually observably happening. Does anything in the world that you guys know of right now that is really simple, very simple, and is developing by itself into something really complex and organized? Does anybody know of anything like that in the world right now that's all by itself developing from extremely simple to extremely complex and organized? Do you? I don't. But this is the theory, see? And how many new species? I'm not talking about new variations of mutt. I'm talking about new species are being developed currently. Accidentally, naturally, without any human intervention. See, Darwin's little book, which I've gone over with people for years, The Origin of the Species by Means of Natural, underline natural, selection. That means without any outside help of any kind, all by itself. Okay. So, again, ask this question. There's no answer to it except that the theory is, by the way, you've got to realize that the theory of evolution is a theory. And they'll say, well, your creation is a theory in our view. Okay, let's see which one has more evidence to support it. All right, so let's talk about this. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? Isn't this the chicken or the egg? Now, Vivian thinks that the chicken came first. But she probably thinks that because eggs come out of where? They come out of chickens, don't they? You know, whoop, whoop, plump, there comes an egg. Isn't that pretty much, Chuck, how it happens right there? Yeah, pretty much. Okay. So chicken, then egg. But wait a minute. But where do you get the chicken? Well, it usually pecks its way out of a what? An egg. Yeah. Okay. Well, so you got your tiny teacup poodle up there in the top left. My father-in-law had one named Red that was just about this big, full grown. He was a pistol. And he even had him cremated. And so when Billy died and Red died, they got buried they got cremated at the same time. So in the urn was 95% Billy and 5% Red. In the urn, see? Teacup poodle. Well, then his relative, like Darwin did by putting different finches together and mating them, you breed enough poodles together and you can get the big dog underneath him. That's a full-size standard, oui, monsieur, poodle. See? He's a full-size poodle. But then, good gravy, in that upper right-hand corner, you got a doodle. But wait a minute, where'd the doodle come from? I think, if I'm not mistaken, the doodle came when the poodle got with a Labrador, like that one down in a Labradoodle, see? And that's how you got that doodle, a Labradoodle up there. But those are all dogs, right? I've heard that all dogs go to heaven. I'm not sure I believe that. I'm certain about cats, that they don't. But I've heard that all dogs go to heaven. But cats have got too much attitude to ever go to heaven. But they're still dogs. And we can breed those things until we go crazy, and we're still going to get some kind of a noodle or a doodle or something else that we're not going to get something different than a mutt when it's all said and done. Okay. And so, you know, we don't get things full grown. They all come from somewhere today, but the Bible says that an infinite God created everything full grown, and those full grown things reproduce. Notice this recurring phrase in the Genesis account. God said, "Let the earth bring forth the living creatures according to its kind, cattle and creeping things and the beasts of the earth, each according to its kind." And it was so. And God made the beast of the earth according to its kind, and cattle according to its kind, and everything that creeps upon the earth according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. So yes, they can ebb and flow within their species, but can cats and dogs make a kitty dog? No. You can't do it. And, you know, so that's demonstrable in nature stuff right now, that things reproduce according to their kind. They don't reproduce and produce brand new species. See, not because we have seen anything like that. Okay, next time, Lord willing, and this will be our last shot, what about the 6 days of creation? What in the world are we supposed to believe about that? And we'll discuss this and look into it a little bit next time. And then our class will be over. And we're going to study a biblical book next time. So y'all have a good time, and we'll see you at church, hopefully. Up. Yes, ma'am. Yes. Yes. Mm-hmm. Well, it's sort of like this life is our chance, and the postmodern would say this is us. And if there is, many of them would not be atheists. They would be what we would call agnostic. And they would say there could be something out there after death. We just have no way of knowing. Okay, y'all have a, yes, ma'am. Yep. Yeah, everything that's found comes from another species. Absolutely right. Okay, we're dismissed.